There's a version of Jesus that almost nobody in the Western world grew up picturing. Not the gentle shepherd of Sunday school felt boards. Not the soft-eyed figure of Renaissance paintings with pale skin and quiet sorrow. Ancient texts describe something else entirely. A figure whose face burns brighter than the sun, who sits enthroned amid 10,000 times 10,000 attending beings, whose hair is white as wool and whose voice sounds like rushing water. That description isn't a modern invention. It comes from real ancient writings, some of them older than the New Testament itself, and while most of the Western Church quietly stopped reading them centuries ago, one church never did. And now, 20 years after making the most successful religious film in American history, Mel Gibson is trying to bring that older, stranger vision of Christ to the screen. To understand where Gibson's new film is actually pulling its imagery from, you have to start with a genuinely fascinating and well-documented piece of religious history, not a conspiracy, but a real story about how the Christian Bible took shape over centuries, and about one church that ended up preserving more of that early material than any other. In the 4th century, as Christianity spread across the Roman world, different regions and communities were still working out exactly which of the many circulating religious texts, gospels, letters, apocalypses, and visionary writings, should be treated as authoritative scripture. This wasn't settled in a single afternoon by a single council. It was a slow, uneven, centuries-long process involving multiple regional synods, influential bishops writing letters to their congregations, and a great deal of ordinary communities simply continuing to read what they'd always read. One of the councils involved in that broader process met in the city of Laodicea, in what's now western Turkey, sometime around 363 or 364 AD, and among its many rulings on matters of church discipline, it included a list of books considered appropriate for public reading, a list many modern scholars believe was actually added to the council's records somewhat later rather than being part of the original proceedings. Around the same period, the influential Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria wrote a widely circulated Easter letter in 367 AD listing the 27 books that would eventually become the New Testament as most Western Christians know it today. What actually happened to the texts left off lists like these is less dramatic, and in some ways more human, than a story of bishops ordering coordinated book burnings across the empire. Some writings simply fell out of regular liturgical use over generations. Some were preserved by scholars and monks as historically interesting even after they stopped being read as scripture. Others survived in translation in communities on the edges of the Roman world, valued exactly as much as they'd always been, because those communities were never part of the debates happening in Mediterranean church centers in the first place. That's precisely what happened in Ethiopia, and it's a genuinely remarkable story on its own terms, without needing an invented conspiracy to make it compelling. Christianity arrived in the Ethiopian highlands in the 4th century, brought by a shipwrecked young man named Frumentius who eventually became the region's first bishop, at almost exactly the same historical moment that councils and bishops across the Mediterranean were debating canon lists thousands of miles away. Ethiopia's church grew up largely independent of Roman and Constantinopolitan oversight, developing its own theology, its own church structure, and crucially, its own sacred language, Gu'izi, an ancient liturgical tongue still used in worship today. Then, in the 7th century, the rapid expansion of the early Islamic caliphates across North Africa and the Near East effectively cut the Ethiopian highlands off from regular contact with the rest of the Christian Mediterranean world for centuries. That isolation, more geographic and political than any deliberate act of resistance, meant Ethiopian Christian communities simply kept using and copying the fuller set of scriptures they'd received in their earliest years, largely undisturbed by the narrowing canon debates unfolding elsewhere. Generations of monks, working in stone monasteries carved into highland cliffs, some still reachable today only by rope or narrow footholds worn into rock, continued copying those texts by hand across centuries of regional wars, famines, and the rise and fall of neighboring kingdoms they had little contact with. The result is that the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church today maintains one of the broadest biblical canons in the Christian world, commonly cited as including around 81 books in its narrower reckoning, with an even larger set of texts, sometimes counted as high as 88, treated as sacred literature more broadly. That's substantially larger than the 66 books most Protestant Bibles contain, or the 73 in Catholic Bibles. Inside that wider Ethiopian canon sit texts that most Western Christians have never encountered outside a seminary library or an academic footnote. The Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, and the Ascension of Isaiah among them. These aren't obscure fringe writings invented centuries later. They're genuinely ancient Jewish and early Christian texts, and their survival, largely intact, in Ethiopia's living liturgical tradition is one of the more remarkable facts in the history of religious literature. Take the Book of Enoch specifically, since it's the text most central to the vision Gibson appears to be drawing on. Enoch isn't a late forgery. Fragments of it, written in Aramaic, were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, physical manuscript evidence dating to centuries before the birth of Christ, discovered in the 20th century and confirmed by scholars to represent a genuinely ancient text that circulated widely in Jewish communities around the turn of the era. Several early Christian writers, including figures like Tertullian in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, treated Enoch as a legitimate and worthwhile text, even as its status remained debated in different communities. Most strikingly, the New Testament itself directly quotes it. The brief Epistle of Jude, included in every Western Bible printed today, cites Enoch by name and treats his prophecy as authoritative, in Jude chapter 1, verses 14 and 15. That's a genuinely striking detail worth sitting with. A book quoted approvingly inside the Bible most Christians read today was itself a text that gradually fell out of regular use in most of the Western canon-forming tradition, while continuing to be read, chanted, and treated as scripture without interruption in Ethiopia. What does Enoch actually say about Jesus, or more precisely, about the figure it calls the Son of Man? The imagery is genuinely overwhelming by the standards of most modern religious art. Enoch describes a heavenly figure whose head is white like wool, who sits enthroned in a court blazing with fire, surrounded by attending beings numbering in the tens of thousands, who judges the powers of heaven and earth from that throne. This isn't a solitary teacher on a dusty road. It's a cosmic judge and sovereign, described in language that predates the Gospels themselves. Here's where the genuinely fascinating scholarly connection comes in, one that biblical scholars have written about extensively without needing any conspiracy framework to explain it. Turn to the very last book of the New Testament, the Book of Revelation, one of the texts every major Christian tradition agrees belongs in Scripture, and read its opening vision of the risen Christ. Hair white as wool, white as snow, eyes like blazing fire, a voice like the sound of many waters. The parallels to Enoch's description of the Son of Man are strikingly close enough that scholars of early Jewish and Christian apocalyptic literature have long treated Enoch as a direct and significant influence on the imagery John of Patmos used to describe his vision of Christ. This isn't a fringe theory. It's a well-established area of biblical scholarship. The author of Revelation was almost certainly drawing on a shared pool of Jewish apocalyptic imagery that Enoch had helped shape generations earlier. Revelation didn't need to secretly smuggle in banned material. It was working within a visionary tradition that educated readers of its own time would likely have recognized. The genuinely interesting historical question isn't, what did the church try to hide? But, how much of Revelation's cosmic imagery came from a wider well of Jewish apocalyptic writing that most later Christians simply stopped reading directly, even as its influence remained baked into the one text from that tradition everyone agreed to keep? The Ascension of Isaiah, the other major text in this tradition, offers an equally striking and equally underknown piece of theology. It describes the cosmos as a series of 7 heavens, each more radiant than the one below it, and tells the story of Christ's descent through all 7 on his way to being born in Bethlehem, veiling his overwhelming glory at each level so that the beings of that realm could perceive him without being destroyed by the encounter. By the time he arrives in the manger, according to the text, his divine nature is folded so completely into ordinary human flesh that even the angels guarding the scene don't fully grasp what has just entered the world. It's a genuinely beautiful and theologically rich piece of early Christian reflection on the Incarnation, treating the Nativity not as a small, sentimental scene but as the final step of an immense cosmic journey. Icons in Ethiopian churches still depict Christ this way, surrounded by radiating panels representing that hidden fire rather than simple wealth or decoration. This is the tradition Mel Gibson appears to be reaching toward in his long-gestating sequel to The Passion of the Christ. Gibson has spoken about this project for years, describing it in a January 2025 conversation on The Joe Rogan Experience as something like an acid trip, not because of any chemical reference, but because of how far outside a conventional linear narrative he intends the story to travel. He said publicly, including in interviews discussing the film's development, that the story doesn't begin at the empty tomb, or even in Bethlehem, but reaches back to the fall of the angels, describing a structure that has to be, in his words, underpinned by a great deal of salvation history and theology because the material itself is so complex. Production on the film, officially titled The Resurrection of the Christ, finally began in October of 2025 at Cinecittà Studios in Rome, the same storied lot where The Passion of the Christ and countless earlier historical epics were built, with additional location filming across southern Italy in towns including Matera, Genoa, and Krakow. Filming wrapped in April of 2026 after 134 days of shooting, split across 2 films with a combined reported budget in the range of $100 to $125 million, a striking increase from the $30 million budget of the original 2004 film. Gibson co-wrote the script with his longtime collaborator Randall Wallace and developed the story with his brother Donald Gibson, reportedly spending years consulting with theologians before finalizing the screenplay. The film has already generated its share of headlines beyond its subject matter. Jim Caviezel, whose performance as Jesus in the original film became genuinely iconic, will not be reprising the role. Gibson opted to recast rather than use de-aging technology, choosing Finnish actor Jaakko Otonen for the part instead, alongside Mariella Garriga as Mary Magdalene, replacing Monica Bellucci from the original. Lionsgate, which is distributing the film through Gibson's own Icon Productions, has shifted the release schedule more than once since the project was first confirmed as actively filming. As of mid-2026, The Resurrection of the Christ, Part 1, is scheduled for release on May 6, 2027, timed deliberately to land on Ascension Day, the holiday marking the New Testament's account of Christ's ascension into heaven 40 days after Easter, with Part 2 following on May 25, 2028, also landing on Ascension Day that year. What's actually confirmed about the film's content, beyond its release logistics, remains fairly limited, and it's worth being honest about where reporting ends and speculation begins. Gibson has indicated publicly that the story opens with the fall of the angels, a tradition rooted in some of the same broader apocalyptic literature that shaped Enoch, and that the narrative involves battles between angelic and demonic forces as part of its cosmic framing for the resurrection itself. Lionsgate's Motion Picture Group chair, Adam Fogelson, described the completed film as operating at a level of epic spectacle, combined with genuine theological depth, calling it one of the most anticipated theatrical events in a generation. Beyond those general descriptions, Gibson has kept the specifics of the film's structure and imagery closely guarded, reportedly restricting access to the screenplay even among international distributors negotiating rights deals, a level of secrecy unusual enough in the film industry to become a story in its own right, reflecting significant trust in Gibson's track record after the original film's stunning and widely underestimated commercial success 2 decades earlier. Whether or not Gibson's finished film draws explicitly and directly on Enoch or the ascension of Isaiah, and whether it credits the tradition by name, the broader thematic territory he's described reaching for, a resurrection that unfolds across multiple cosmic layers rather than a single linear scene, a Christ whose full nature is almost too vast to render in ordinary cinematic terms, clearly resonates with exactly the kind of literature the Ethiopian Church spent 16 centuries quietly preserving while most of the Western Christian world moved on to a narrower, more streamlined canon. That's not evidence of a hidden cover-up finally being exposed by a Hollywood director. It's a genuinely interesting overlap between an ancient, well-documented theological tradition and a modern filmmaker's own artistic instincts about how vast the Easter story might actually be, arrived at independently rather than smuggled out from behind some historical wall. It's worth also mentioning the Book of Jubilees, the third major text preserved in the Ethiopian canon's broader tradition alongside Enoch and the Ascension of Isaiah, since it rounds out the picture of just how much ancient material survived intact in the highlands. Jubilees retells the stories of Genesis and part of Exodus with an added calendrical and theological framework, organizing history into cycles of 49 years and offering an expanded, often startlingly detailed account of events only briefly mentioned in Genesis itself. Like Enoch, Jubilees isn't a late invention. Fragments of it were also recovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls. More copies of Jubilees were found at Qumran than of most books that did make it into the standard Hebrew Bible, which tells you something about how widely read and valued it actually was among at least some Jewish communities in the centuries before and after Christ's life. Its survival as living scripture in Ethiopia, rather than as a scholarly curiosity translated centuries later from scattered fragments, is part of the same broader story. A community that kept using what it had always used, without needing to relitigate decisions being made in councils an ocean away. It's also worth remembering just how genuinely improbable Gibson's original 2004 film was as a commercial proposition, because it's central to why studios and international distributors have been willing to extend him this much trust and secrecy on the sequel. The Passion of the Christ was shot almost entirely in Aramaic and Latin, with subtitles, depicting the final 12 hours of Jesus' life with a level of graphic, unflinching violence that made major studios pass on distributing it entirely. Gibson financed it largely himself, reportedly putting in tens of millions of dollars of his own money after failing to secure traditional studio backing, betting his own reputation and finances on a film every industry executive around him predicted would fail commercially. Made on a budget of roughly $30 million, it went on to gross more than $600 million worldwide, becoming one of the highest-grossing R-rated films in American box office history, a record that stood for years afterward. That result reshaped how the industry thought about faith-based audiences for the following 2 decades, and it's a large part of why, more than 20 years later, international buyers were reportedly willing to commit significant money to distribution rights for the sequel without being allowed to read the finished script beforehand, an arrangement almost unheard of at that scale in the industry, but one that reflects just how much credibility Gibson earned by beating the odds so dramatically. The first time. Life inside the monasteries that preserved this material for so long is itself worth picturing clearly, because it's easy to reduce 16 centuries of continuous copying to an abstract fact rather than an enormous, sustained human effort. Ethiopian monastic scribes worked with reed pens dipped in ink made from soot, gum, and water, copying manuscripts onto parchment by hand, page after page, across generations, in scriptoriums built into cliffside monasteries in the Tigray highlands, some accessible even today only by climbing rope ladders or narrow rock-cut footholds worn smooth by centuries of use. These communities weren't isolated from all hardship during that stretch of time. The region saw invasions, famines, and shifting political control across the centuries. The Ethiopian Church maintained its independence, and monastic copying continued through all of it, not as an act of quiet defiance against a distant council's ruling, since most of these monks would have had no direct knowledge of decisions made in 4th century Asia Minor, but simply as an ordinary, unbroken continuation of a religious practice they'd inherited and had no reason to abandon. It's a story about how differently a shared religious tradition can develop when it grows up largely outside the reach of the political and ecclesiastical centers that eventually standardized it elsewhere. Geography, isolation, and an unbroken monastic tradition preserved a wider, richer body of ancient religious literature in the Ethiopian highlands than survived through continuous public use almost anywhere else in the Christian world. That's a remarkable, well-documented fact of religious history on its own terms, and it doesn't need an invented conspiracy about power-hungry bishops secretly burning away access to God to be worth taking seriously. If anything, treating it as a hidden secret only now being uncovered undersells just how openly this material has actually been available to scholars, translators, and curious readers for well over a century, sitting in plain sight in one of Christianity's oldest continuously practicing traditions, waiting for the rest of the world to notice. Whatever Gibson ultimately puts on screen in May of 2027, the older tradition his film seems to be reaching toward has never actually been lost. It's been chanted in Gu-Ez in mountain monasteries in Ethiopia for 16 centuries, read aloud by monks who never once thought of themselves as guarding a secret, simply as people continuing to do what their own teachers had always done. The real story here isn't a forbidden truth finally breaking free after centuries of suppression. It's a much quieter, much more human story about how faith, geography, and sheer persistence can keep an entire tradition alive in one corner of the world, long after most of the world assumed there was nothing left to find there.